Hello, everybody. We're gathering. I'll put a link to the agenda. If you have any items to talk about today, please put them there. Guess I need to track down where our doc is, huh? All right, do we have anybody interested in helping us take notes today?
I can help you to take some notes to the
Excellent.
best of my abilities, but I'm also trying to get Thomas here.
Great.
Because due to your daylight saving, I think the meeting moved in our calendar. Just want to make sure that he noticed that.
Okay. Yeah, this is always a challenging couple of weeks while the world realigns. Well, while we're waiting, do we have any new friends that wanted to say hello and introduce themselves to the group? Please.
Hey, I'm Gabriel Gustreis. I work at Microsoft on the native programming language tools division.
Excellent.
So mostly C and C++. And before joining Microsoft 10 years ago, I used to work on the GNU compiler collection. I was one of the release managers for 17 years.
Wow. Cool. Well, welcome. Glad to have you around.
Thank you.
Anyone else like to introduce themselves? It's getting hot. All right, give me a moment to track down our doc. Do you know, did we get that copied up to our Git repo, George, yet?
Mm-hmm.
Well, great.
Yep.
You
Well, mean the markdown?
Yeah.
There's a markdown doc in the
Awesome.
repo.
Great. Let me find that and I will tack that onto the notes so we don't have to keep fumbling around for it.
That's a good idea. Way too pragmatic.
All right, folks, let me grab this. So we actually have two documents. We had initially started a Google document as the working group very early in our history. And that effort went a little dormant for a while. And then our friends at Ericsson joined us and helped share the markdown file that we're going to look at. And that actually was much more comprehensive and better organized. So we were taking some steps to review the original Google document and see where we wanted to weave it into this more structured document. And then we had the grand idea that, hey, there are other compilers that people care about. So I have looped in the crew from Intel. And so hopefully we'll be getting some similar feedback on the ICC compiler. And we just recently reached out to our friends in Redmond, and now we've got some Microsoft folks, and hopefully they might be able to share some information so that we have a similar set of recommendations around folks using the Microsoft compiler. That's kind of a summary. Where would we like to start? Oh, there's Thomas. Thomas is our little group leader. Time changes are the worst, Thomas. I agree.
Yeah, hello. Sorry, I'm late. I completely missed that.
No worries. Mr. Wheeler.
Yeah, we had talked about this before, but I think there, welcome the Microsoft C compiler in. My suspicion is that it may be easier to make that a separate document, or at most a separate appendix, just because syntactically all the options are different. I think in many cases there are different options you'd want to invoke anyway. So within this group, great. It might be a lot easier to maintain as a pair of documents, just because of those, of all those differences. That said, if we can cross compare, that'd be cool. But you know what? If the Microsoft compiler has some option that doesn't make sense for anybody else, well, not option, some capability that's different, and vice versa, then then that's great.
So where would we like to work today? We want to dive into the Markdown file. Do we want to look at the original working group document to see if there's anything we want to salvage out of there?
I would start with that, and I know that Randall eventually wanted to do some cross compares, but
Yeah, I agree. I think it would be good to look at this original Google document. I guess that we haven't really gotten to that yet, even though it's been kind of on the agenda for a couple of calls now. So maybe it's a good time to do that.
Yeah, if I may, I don't know if anybody noticed, but there were a whole bunch of Markdown lint complaints, and I fixed them all. So yay! It's not so much that lint fixes are exciting, but the idea is to start with a relatively clean document, and then we can kind of go from there.
I have some other repos if you want to help fix some linting errors.
Thank you for the opportunity, Craig.
And I'm especially grateful since I'm the source for a lot of those linting errors. So thank you very much.
Yeah, there's an odd formatting thing where after the equal sign, there's a mysterious space. I don't think it should be there, but there it is. It doesn't inhibit the value of this thing, but sometime somewhere in copious free time, or frankly somebody else wants to look and see why that is and how to fix that, that'd be awesome. It's a minor formatting thing. I'd like to focus today on the meat, but if somebody wants to go figure out what the heck is causing that, that'd be awesome.
I have a related question to our ways of working. So I pushed a PR earlier today, basically just following David's lead and adding more links to the document. Those hyperlinks, quick links to get from the overview table to the relevant sections. First, apparently since I contributed to this repo first, the linting workflow doesn't start automatically. That seems to be a default thing. Does anybody know if that will be fixed for later PRs? Because right now a maintainer needs to approve that. And then the second question is, how do we? I know there have been discussions around that in the OpenSSF in general, like the configuration of permissions and stuff like that. on the repos, because they can't really add reviewers officially and all of that. Do we have a solution for that, or is it just the way it is right now?
Yes, we have a solution. Yes, that is the way it will be for the short term. I
Okay.
am working with a gentleman that is assisting the LF staff on fixing Git permissions. And we fixed another of my working groups yesterday, vulnerability disclosures,
Okay.
kind of resetting things. And I will encourage him to look at the best practices working group maybe today if he has time.
Awesome.
Jordan's helping us, so I'll see if I can get us set up and making sure that George and Thomas, you guys are both in the right group to be able to manage PRs.
Yeah, basically, we've been walking through the permissions of the entire organization, trying to move everything into groups so that it's much easier to figure, you're in this group, therefore you can do this. If I recall correctly, once, and I may be wrong about this, but once you're permitted once for the linting on a pull request, that continues on, if I recall correctly.
Seems to be like that according to the GitHub documentation. I just
so-
looked it up, but yeah, okay, good.
Yeah, so basically, for the first time, then that's going to be the case. But I think that's just the first time you do it, and then
Okay.
and that disappears. The problem is they don't want to just run random code on arbitrary commits by just anybody.
Why is that? Yeah, no, that's fine. Okay.
So yeah, I'll poke. I don't know what time zone Jordan's in, but I will poke him, asking him to look at the best practices working group so that we can get everybody where they need to be able to work more efficiently. And I went through and I've approved your pull request, so it should be merged. Yeah, Randall, we got to talk about this linter. Randall.
What's wrong with it?
It seems to be causing some opportunities with some of our submitted PRs.
I can look into it.
Yeah,
Yeah, I don't think it's specific to the linter. I think all pull requests, the first time you do, it won't run code until you said
okay.
okay.
Oh yeah, that's valid for all workflows. So
Yeah.
don't blame Randall specifically for the
Oh,
linking.
I'll
Well,
find
you
something to
can,
blame
but it's-
Randall on.
Yeah. So if you want, do we want to?
Yeah, let's dive in. I put the link to the older doc and the current MD file where we would want to ultimately land the changes.
Okay. So let's see here. I'm trying to look at two things at once. I do eventually want to kind of walk through the text and top, but I don't think we need a group to do that unless you really want to. So maybe what we ought to do is just kind of walk through the options from the other document and at least begin the discussion of seeing if there's any options that should flow in. I think most of them are there, but there are some questions or differences. And we don't have to resolve it all today. So if we look at the current document there, we've got wall format 2 and a couple of things. Whoops, I see Randall's hands up.
Yeah, I wanted to actually say something because I remember that I was going to get the default profile for
Yeah.
GCC. I was talking to those people and also the Gen 2 people, some of which are on the kernel team. There was a question if we want to, like, if this document's supposed to identify the already enabled defaults or the security options that need to be enabled so that you have what is generally considered a hardened binary when it comes out, because a lot of what we reviewed off of this document is already enabled by default.
enabled by default, and which default do you mean? The
The
compiler
so
default?
if you run GCC without any flags, it'll default to its default profile, which already has a lot of this enabled.
But I think that there are still like these differences depending on where you source GCC from, right?
That is
So,
correct.
Yeah, so
But generally speaking, most of these flags are generally enabled.
Enabled where? Within the distros from this original source? And I think we're going back for older versions too, like GCC 8 and such.
No, even the GCC 12 has default profiles.
No, I'm sorry, I'm not being clear. If a newer version of GCC has it on by default, that doesn't mean that it's on by default in older versions.
That is correct.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
I know that like at this point in the Linux community, I think anything like beyond GCC 9 or is or below GCC 9 is kind of like considered out of date. Most people are distributing 11 or 12.
Yeah, I don't know who these most people are, but I'm talking about you're talking about the Linux distros, and I'm thinking about the IoT devices where they hope to start using the Linux from 14 years ago someday,
Okay.
maybe. Yeah, Chrome is going horror. Yeah, but let's just say that IoT folks are not necessarily the leading edge. They're not even necessarily up to the trailing edge.
So are you saying that you don't want me to bring in those people to view this document, or
Oh
what are you trying to
I
say,
don't.
David?
No. They're quite the reverse. It's that if it's truly in the defaults and it's all even for older versions, then great. Maybe we don't need to bother or mention it in a.
Well, that's what the clarification is, because like fortifications 2 is generally enabled in all
Yeah.
across the Linux community. It's generally accepted. If your software is not compiling with that, then it is a bug.
Yeah, so like maybe I can sort of maybe explain what the rationale was for me to pick up these options, since I've sort of maybe responsible now for this current set. And we when we did this initial document, we made this decision that we are not going to assume that anything is default, because we sort of have this situation where we couldn't like really rely on like any particular GCC version, because the reality is that there are, depending on like exactly in which domain you are working with, in some cases you are sourcing GCC from the Linux distribution, which is the target environment. In some cases the target environment is something else, and then GCC can be sourced from another vendor or even mainline. And we were sort of looking at this and concluding that there are, depending on the GCC version and depending on where you source GCC, these GCC from, the defaults are different. So we sort of decided that we are not going to assume anything is by on default. We're going to make a kind of like a list of options that are security relevant. And this is of course something that something that should be sort of discussed, right? So what is security relevant? And this is one interpretation of what is security relevant. But yeah, like certainly certainly I think there is like room for discussion on what should be in this document. But I think it's also like a little bit risky to kind of make this assumption that even though there is this notion that, especially like in the open source world, there is kind of like a safe default, but unfortunately it might be a little bit sort of optimistic to expect that the entire world actually has the latest and greatest GCC, and can rely on that there is like a default profile, unfortunately. Right, but that goes into also like this discussion that who is the sort of the who is the sort of the target audience for this, right? So I'm sort of of course, openly admit that this was initially something that we started for internal use, and sort of the requirements there might be different from what is beneficial for the community as a whole. And of course, now we should drive it into a direction where it's most useful to the community as a whole.
From my understanding, there are certain flags that your software should compile with. It goes beyond security, just like if it doesn't compile with, for example, the CXX assertions, basically it's considered a bug at this point. So in other words, like it has to compile with those things. Now, as far as fortifications, the reason for the question is because, as I said, most software should compile with fortifications too. It's generally accepted that if it doesn't compile with fortifications too, you have a bug. In the next 6 months, from a security standpoint, they've been testing out using fortifications 3, and I know within the next 6 months to a year, that's going to be the recommendation. I know that might not be the default, but I know that's what currently is like. If you're looking for like security recommendations according to them, they're already recommending Fortify Sources 3.
So we had Gabriel and then Sadesh were next with questions or comments.
Oh, yeah. So the whole conversation about compiler version, make me wonder, and about fortification makes me wonder if we really want to cover all existing versions of GCC. Fortification 3 was introduced only a year ago, and GCC maintains three versions, 3 branches. So what are we aiming for? Are we aiming for the ones that are actively maintained, or the ones that are known to, like, the bugs and the flaws are known to community will change? And what is the target audience here? So Gentoo, for example, has been, building the entire distro for Fortification 3 and finding a lot of bugs, security bugs, and they would like to push the community in that direction. So is that something we want to encourage or just hold back? So I think, in my personal opinion, I think it will help a lot the community if we were able to, like, set end versions, and end is up to debate, and then just cap the doc, keep it living and cap it to those end versions, supposed to try to cover all, release version of the compilers.
Very good point, Gabriel. Any comments?
I have a comment, but I think Sadesh is ahead of me.
He is.
Right. So I actually, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Perfect. Thanks. I'm sorry, I did not introduce myself earlier because I was driving. But I work at Red Hat. I did Tulchin security. So, and I'm one of the, I am the author of Fortify Source 3. So I'll address the Fortify Source 3 question a little bit later. But I wanted to first talk about the GCC build flags and how they get handled in the distribution, because it's a little bit more nuanced than what is being suggested. So there are a lot of flags that get get enabled by default, a lot of security flags, but then they're enabled by default for distribution, which is to build packages. If you're using GCC in your application, it may not necessarily have all of those flags enabled. Like, for example, in Ubuntu, you have PIE enabled by default, but on Fedora, that's not the case. So you'll probably get PIE by default on Ubuntu, but not on Fedora. Fortify Source, again, you need to explicitly pass that flag to kind of make that available, or to build your application with. So I think in that context, all of these flags are relevant, in the sense that all of the end user application developers will want to know what flags to enable in their application to build their application. As far as distributions are concerned, distributions have their own thing, and in that kind of ecosystem, you can say that they're fairly evolved in terms of what kind of distribution flags that they want to, what kind of security flags they want to enable in their distribution. So that was about compiler flags. And about fortification, it is true that we're trying to push Fortify Source 3 in multiple distributions. I think OpenSUSE was the first to build the entire distribution with Fortify Source 3 by default. Fedora is doing that for Fedora 38. And so far, we haven't found a lot of issues. But then one of the problems with Fortify Source in general, and this is not just limited to 3, is that it behaves a little oddly with flex arrays, especially flex arrays that were done like in the old way, where you kind of just tag an array at the end of the struct and expect the compiler to be able to handle it. And because of that, there are some applications, some popular applications that tend to disable Fortify Source, like Vim, for example, is one of those. Vim does not build with Fortify Source enabled. It explicitly disables Fortify Source. So there are those issues that we're trying to deal with in GCC. King Zhao from Oracle is trying to improve the way the compiler works with flex arrays, and then we have more kind of stricter flags to make sure that applications are using flex arrays correctly, as in the new kind of sense, without the 0 subscript to the 1 subscript. There's a new flag called fstrict flex arrays, which is going to come in GCC 13. And I think that they have a similar flag in Clang as well. So that'll hopefully help improve things.
Excellent.
David?
If I may, I have a comment, and I think we're moving smartly on to some changes to the document, because I think this is not just a discussion; it's an important one. I view there being at least three major groups that might use this document. The group that probably will use this the least are the Linux distributions. I mean, if we can make it helpful for them, that would be awesome. And I think we can make it helpful for them, but a little more indirectly. Most of the major Linux distros already have a pretty refined set of flags. They care about them a lot. But the problem for the Linux distros, as was just mentioned, is that the application developers often don't use those flags when they write their code. So the Vim is not trying to be evil and malicious. Vim wrote some code that works under their compiler options, and that's how they test. And then the Linux distros get the joys of trying to deal with that. And so the second group of users is really the folks who are developing applications, open source applications, because we want them to test with all these option flags. And the final group, and Randall, there's a terminology thing that I'm using, but you may not be noticing. There's the Linux community and there's the Linux distributors or Linux distributor communities, and those aren't the same thing. There's a huge number of IoT devices where they recompile Linux kernel. They aren't Linux distributions in the sense of a Fedora or a Red Hat Enterprise Linux or a Gentoo or a Debian or Ubuntu, but they sure as heck compile the Linux kernel. They compile lots of other things. And it's whatever the default in their old compiler is. I agree we can't support compilers back to the beginning of time, but I think we ought to be a little more flexible in terms of the compiler range used, because we should absolutely, if you've got the current compiler, here's the flags you should use. If you don't have the current version of a compiler because, say, your application doesn't compile that way, we should support several versions back. Because that's, we should encourage people to update to the latest compilers, but we should also encourage them to use the best options available until they fix that. So let me give for instance. We've been talking about Fortify Source. The current document says Fortify Source 1 for strictly compile time source, Fortify Source 2 for runtime protection. I think for the runtime, we should recommend Fortify source 3 where you can, and then note that you may need to back off, and then the details explaining the back off and rationale. And by the way, I don't think that that's really clear in, for example, the GCC pages, at least the man page, why you might need to back it off. So I think, and what this would do is, for example, for all the Linux distros, say, hey, Vim, run your test this way, and the Vim folks will go, it doesn't work. And the distros will say, right. And it will help all the folks downstream, because upstream folks will test it with the stronger options. So anyway, that's a specific user sets and particular change that would come from that.
George, then Thomas, and then Randall.
Yeah, unfortunately, David covered most of what I wanted to say, obviously. Yeah, no, I think the 3 categories are really nice, because basically what I wanted to say is, even though if there's a default profile, I think it does make sense to spell out explicitly all the options we consider to be important for various reasons, and then David kind of carved out these different use cases. So like coming back to the original, let's say, question from Randall, I wasn't really sure if that was considered to be a problem or not, if some of those options are enabled by default, because I wouldn't consider it a problem really. I would still cover them in the document, not just for educational purposes, but for all of the reasons David mentioned. So just basically wanted to add my 2 cents to that discussion.
Yeah, I also agree with you, David, that I think that this would be like personally, I think that this would be the best way to go, to try to cover like each of these variants. And this is like, I think that we have sort of established this, that this is sort of clearly like clearly our mission, the Fortify source 3. And I think that like the way to deal with this most sanely is that when we have like these specific sections that have like the more detailed description of the option, we can cover like each of these variants in that. And then in this overall table of the recommended options, we can bump that up to Fortify source 3, and that can somehow like represent sort of the latest and greatest of, or what is sort of our understanding of the latest and greatest. And then maybe like a little bit on, I'd like to also like add to this discussion on like the versioning. So I would also not want to sort of try to cover like a specific, these are the specific options you need if you have like an ages-old GCC. But what we try to do is that at least give like an idea of that if you're working with an older GCC, like what options can you look at, right? And maybe like the columns here are actually might be a little bit misnamed, right? So there is like the supported by. I think that maybe it should be better even to say supported since, but that's on me. I'm not a native English speaker, so sometimes the choice of words can be a little bit misleading. But yeah, I think that there is kind of like a good rationale for trying to keep like the recommended table to represent somehow this latest and greatest. But also I think that should be like the latest and greatest, like regardless of what the distributions actually are doing, because like as you also pointed out, David, the distributions have their corresponding documents, and if you're interested in what they're doing, it's maybe better just to read their documents.
Randall.
I was gonna add, I agree with everything you said, but David, in an ideal world that would work, but in reality, most people do use Debian like in their pipelines, and they just install GCC from there. So
I don't know who this most. Wait. Who's this most?
Well, I mean, I work with a lot. I mean, in Gentoo, we work directly with upstream bunch of projects. I mean, I can't. One doesn't come to mind, but I mean, generally from what I see in people's pipelines, they don't have flags. They just have input, output, download from Debian, input, output, it compiled, test pass. The vast majority of projects go like that. They don't actually have a set of flags they compile with. If not, that would help the Gentoo project tremendously. But most projects don't have that.
I'm not sure about most of majority. Those are always dangerous things to do. So the issue that you're saying though is that a lot of folks just say, "Hey, Debian, compile this," and
no, what I'm
whatever
saying is that most people don't have a recommended set of flags. You can ask them, but in my years of being in Gentoo, it's been a handful of times that I can actually remember that a project has, oh, these are the flags we recommend and these are the flags we compile with, or that we even test with. Most of the time, it's a lot more primitive than that.
Maybe if they had an awesome doc to help guide them, they would do better.
Yep.
Well, what my suggestion would be to maybe make it clear, because I don't think this is necessarily a distro unique problem. I would say it's a packaging unique problem, because Debian and app is used both as in Debian and Ubuntu, but also widely used in containers as well.
A container is just somebody else's thread.
So I would just wanted to make that clear.
All right. So let's talk about specifics, because it's the first one on the recommended runtime protections. Fortify Source 2. And I think this is where it immediately comes to a head. And I think this is where, instead of just looking at the existing document, we can go beyond. I think it would be wise for us to recommend Fortify Source 3 as the recommendation at the top level, and then in the more details note, hey, you sometimes can't do that, and the details explain why, explain your alternatives. But basically trying to give here's the top of the line, strongest possible, and then backing off in the details, noting that you may not be able to enable that for a variety of reasons in your circumstance. And that enables us to give the latest and greatest advice, but also back off to what some folks may be able to do in their circumstance. Thoughts?
I think it sounds good. I would also like to add this note about the flex array that Sidesh pointed out. I think that
Yes.
we are missing that in this when not to use section.
Right.
So I can probably help flesh out the Fortify Source section.
That'd be great. Yeah, if you can just make a pull request specifically on that. I guess what I have in mind is at the top it says, Flex Source 3 requires, I think, O2 in that one, and then in the text it notes, sometimes you can't do this, and the details, it gives the details in terms of, well, 3 showed up here, 2 showed up there. We don't want to lose the information already there, but
Okay.
I very much view this notion of, if Vim, for example, knew that 3 was the recommended practice, there's a chance they might actually test at that.
So Vim, the Vim situation is slightly different, isn't it? They're kind of refusing to move away from their paradigm. So, but there are some others that probably have genuine reasons. I don't know. But yeah, there's a section, Fortify Sources for unsafe libc usage and buffer overflows. That's the one, right? That expands on. Okay, I'll send a PR for that.
But by the way, let me guess, Vim doesn't want to do it because they're also trying to support some older compilers that require that, correct?
Something like that. Oh,
yeah. I'll
other compilers is what they.
Yep. That's and that's going to be a legitimate issue. We're going to see, I think, over and over again. Really, other compilers, older compilers. In order to syntactically support them, you may need to do some weirdness.
with the tracking issues where we're tracking, because I know that there's a couple of projects that have tracking issues for projects that do not compile with Fortify 3. Are those links helpful?
If they help us write this doc, sure.
They'll help people know if there's something that doesn't, like, it's known not to compile with Fortify 3.
Yeah, I like from my side, I would be especially interested in if there are like, you know, specific programming constructs that you can point at that are problematic, like this flex arrays, because I think that would make it a little bit more general purpose, right? So if those if those links help help to actually get an idea of what are the problematic constructs, then I think those would be helpful.
Okay. I don't
GDR?
know if they have that information, but I'll double check.
I guess then it's GDR.
Gabriel, yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, that remark just made me wonder, and what Siddharth was saying earlier. So, flex array is a part of this general construct of variable length array or variable modifier array that were introduced in C99. Then were made optional in C11, precisely because of security issues. And then we are talking about, hey, should we have example of patterns of codes that are problematic and so forth. So that makes me wonder if we actually want to say something, recommend against, in general, the use of variable length arrays, or if we just want it to be Fortify's problem to sort out.
Well, I have an opinion on the topic. I mean, the document is officially about options. So if that doesn't affect options, I think we can say no. However, it will be shocking if some option didn't affect them. So I guess since this document's about compiler options, I guess I would shoehorn that discussion into whichever option is being affected by that particular issue, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, sure.
And we also have the option. I agree. We should stay on point about documenting the options with this artifact. But if we stumble across other useful things, we have other means, whether it's a supplementary supporting document, a blog. We have other means to share this kind of good practice information outside of kind of our focus here of documenting these options.
I actually wanted to comment on Randall's comment. We don't want to create a list of here's all the packages, programs that today don't work with some option. I mean, presumably those particular programs either already know it or will. But hey, Vim doesn't compile with this option. I mean, I don't think we want to try to say that, collect all the programs that don't work with some flag. But what I do think, and absolutely would be vital, mentioning Randall's offer of links, is specific examples of this construct doesn't work, citation. This construct doesn't work, citation. And now instead of this highly abstract, what do you mean? It's pointing to the real world. And I think that's where those kinds of links are absolutely invaluable.
That's kind of just to say the reason that I said the tracking updates is because in the tracking updates you can go and find where the work is happening, and where that discussion is headed. So that's why I said that might be helpful.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, but it's not so much because hey, there's a problem with Vim. It's because this gives the real world example of where this is a problem, where you want to back off, or where it's a significant change and why it's a significant change.
And it might also get you a patch if a patch exists and you need to use it, just saying.
Done.
Yeah, I think also that I agree with this, and I think that we should also be a little bit careful not to sort of make it kind of the possibility to appear to have like any kind of like name and shaming of like specific packages, because I don't think that that's the intent. But again, like if there is like helpful sort of rationale for and especially like like more of this, like this is like a case study of right, where someone might have run into like issues with this and why they are running into it, then I think that's definitely helpful. And then like in terms of like concrete changes, how do we feel about bumping this Fortify? So in the recommended options table, how do we feel about bumping that to then Fortify source 3? And I guess that means also updating this TLDR that David added.
There's a reaction button. You can push yes and no.
I use
Or
a thumbs up, but
Yep. Yeah. As long, I think with the caveat that in the details, frankly, I think we should note in the even in the main top part, you know, sometimes you may need 2 and instead of 3, and then the details, you know, explain, you know, usually you want 3, here's the reasons for 2. You may need to drop to 2, and then frankly, that I would say that this document starts really pulling, becoming ever more valuable with every new edition like that. I mean, it's already useful now, but don't get me wrong, but every time we add that sort of do this, but there are reasons to do that, because at least the current docs aren't always so clear about the trade-off.
Yeah. Okay, but this sounds like not very controversial, so maybe I can take a pass at the best practices, or the recommended options table and the TLDR, and then make this change there.
Awesome.
And you still had a comment, Randall?
yeah, I was gonna suggest. So I used to really help out with the Gen 2 LTO project, which was basically enabling crazy flags. And we built this very good debug section about like if you go through this guide and enable all the flags, then these are the flags you want to remove if it's not building in this order. So I would suggest maybe a little section like that, because that might be a good section to put. Look, if it's not building, then you might want to bump down Fortify sources from 3 to 2, or check if it's a known issue, you know, because that would probably be what I would do for LTO.
Yeah, I think to me that sounds like a very valuable addition, and we already have at the end of the document there is this section on this debug information that is kind of didn't really fit anywhere else. So I think that at least I feel that would be like in reasonably within the scope of this to add like another section that is some kind of some kind of like aid for debugging.
Yeah, like if you enable all of these and it doesn't work, then this is the order to try them out.
Okay. I have one comment related to Fortify Source 3. It's already hinted at in the text of the column if you read carefully, but I'm thinking it might need to be its own row, and that's -02. The reason for -02 is that Fortify Source 3 doesn't do anything unless you turn on -02 or higher. So it could be 03, but you know, I mean, dash capital O, optimizations, because if you don't turn on the optimizations, it won't detect a lot of the problems. And I fear that if it's only a comment in the compiler flag table, people won't turn it on.
But there is in the section, so there is actually like this, if you read about halfway through, to benefit from Fortify source checks, the following requirements must be met, and the first requirement, application must be built with O1 optimizations or higher, which I think is the case for this Fortify source 2, but that should probably then be updated to O2 when the recommended, when the sort of the primary recommendation is Fortify source 2, or then just add another, or then just add that O1 for Fortify source 2 and O2 for Fortify source 3.
No, it'll work with O1 Fortify source 3. It's just that it won't be as effective. And
Right,
same
and
is
we
the case
want
for
it to be-
45 source 201 for that matter.
Fair enough. I mean, you're right. It probably overstated. It's not like it's completely useless, but we want it to be maximally useful. And by the way, in our TLDR, I noticed that we actually did that. There's no -O anywhere. So, even for ourselves, we have to be careful about this.
Yeah, I can add. I'll add O2. Let's say I add O2 there.
Yeah.
Which I think is the default, but yeah, we can be explicit.
Yeah,
about it.
-O2 or O3 or something like that, right?
Yeah. Yes, Randall?
Can I also suggest maybe like I know that like duplicate flags, Sid could probably correct me, but I know that duplicate flags aren't really a problem, but maybe also like explaining how you want to, if you have flags enabled, how you could pull those up just to check if you got it from somewhere and you have stuff enabled and you don't know about it. That might be a useful part in the document. I don't know if that's in there.
You mean like if there is a
Well, as I said, a lot of people use the containers and they use Debian because or Ubuntu because it's the default. So if you do that, you're gonna have default flags enabled.
I think that we have like a little bit of text under this recommended compiler options. So I think that we say something like for historical reasons, the GCC compiler and binutils upstream projects do not enable optimization or security hardening opportunities by default, which might not be actually accurate. So if you have better information, then feel free to improve. But then it goes on and says that while some aspects of the default options can be changed when building GCC and binutils from source, the defaults used in the tool chain shipped with GNU Linux distributions vary. And then there's like a note on like that distros can have multiple versions of tool chains with different defaults, which is at least the case with SUSE, I believe. So would this be like a good place to add?
Yeah, it's
Like
fairly
some-
easy to pull them up. It's just like a command. I forget off the top of my head which one it is, but I know it's just like a
Yeah.
command. You can pull up all your options, and that way you know, if you don't have anything enabled, then you could do whatever you want, But if you don't, if you have things enabled, then maybe you have something enabled that you didn't know was enabled.
Yeah, so if I understand you right, you want to add like this description that if you want to know what options are used
Yeah,
by
if you want to
default,
make
then you
sure.
can use it. Yeah,
Correct.
yeah. I think that could be added at the end of this.
Yeah, agreed. I'll submit a PR. Thank you, Thomas.
Are there any other opinions on this? But at least I don't. I would support this.
Just a quick comment on duplicate flags. As far as macros are concerned, if you assign a different value to a macro, that might end up with a warning. Like for example, with 45 source macro, if the toolchain, the distribution toolchain enables 45 source by default, I think Gentoo does it with some driver hack, and you try to set a different fortification level with your own macro in your application, it might result in a warning and that might break your build. So you need to like explicitly undefine the macro and then redefine it. And then in that too, you have to kind of take care because you have intercepting drivers like Ccache, which tend to consolidate and then redistribute command line arguments to compilers. And I've seen at least one occasion where they got the ordering wrong and they ended up undefining 45 source. That was a bug that got fixed, but maybe something to think about.
But is that something that could be addressed for this 45 source specifically? Because I guess that now it's the only macro we are covering.
Yeah, I can add that into the caveats.
Yeah. Okay, so we are getting to the top of the hour, but
Yeah, I want to add one proposal real quick, to at least start discussions on specifics. Although it doesn't matter for C, dash D, glibc XX assertions basically gives you bounds checking for a number of situations. I hear bounds checking is a potential issue. So,
And I believe
Um,
that I believe recently they said that one, if it doesn't compile with that one, then it's a bug.
well, who's they? I mean,
Well,
yeah.
I'm a developer, so like I compile stuff.
So am I.
I've had
So
that
am I.
flag enabled for a while because the GCC team at Gentoo told me to enable it. So, but I was told because I recently had a problem with a program that wasn't compiling. I think it was Edge, if I'm not mistaken, and we reported it and they fixed it.
Right. But my point though is not everyone has enabled it, and that's why we have this document. So, so the more we can get people to do that and upstreaming it, the better everybody's going to be. And I think so.
I have a question. I'll raise my hand. Sorry.
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
At some point in the guide, are we going to recommend people to like if it doesn't compile with this option, you should open a bug upstream, or is that something we're not recommending?
I mean, it depends. You may be the upstream.
Well, yeah, but you get my point. Like if like for example, you're trying to compile, I don't know, curl, and it doesn't work with certain options that because you're trying to have a fortified or hardened version of curl, and it doesn't compile with one of these options, are we going to recommend people to go and actually open an issue with curl?
I kind of think
reference this guide is what I'm saying, because that's a whole world I don't know if we want to get into.
I guess Gabriel wants to comment on this.
Yeah. Oh, so I wholeheartedly agree with lib CXX assertions. That was actually something that originated between my group and Libstud, Jonathan Wakely, Libstud C++. That we also, we absolutely need to have these things enabled for C++ applications for bound checking, and we have to do it in a way that has minimal performance hit. So I just like we need to have Fortify 3. I think this is really fundamental. Ideally it should be in the language itself, but here we are.
All right, so
if your application that crashes with that enabled, then it should be a bug. I suspect somewhere in the document we say this is best practices, but I think we probably want to have a language like that says, hey, if you enable these options, we say best practices, but if you enable these things, they don't work, treat them as bugs.
I'm going to make a pull request to add this, and people can say whether or not they want to do it. It sounds like there's general agreement. It would be a good idea to add this to the list.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think that we are up on time, but do you have something quick, Sidesh? And then I think it's time to wrap up.
I just quickly wanted to add that we actually did this during Fortify Source 3 enablement for Fedora, where we filed bugs in various packages that broke because of Fortify Source 3, including systemd, where it wasn't technically a bug. It was a corner case where it was basically just bad programming practice, and communities were generally receptive about it. So it's something that you can fairly safely add, and I think everyone wants to go in that direction. So I think we're good there.
Yeah, I think that this is if you're willing to make a PR on how you would want this section to look at, I think that it makes sense to continue this discussion in the comments for that PR.
Sure thing.
Yeah, and we can maybe pick up going through the old document in 2 weeks' time. Okay. Your hand is still up, Gabriel, but where you, okay,
That's the
yeah.
state.
Okay, but I guess that then it's time to wrap up for this time, but thank you very much, everyone. I think this was like a really productive call. We got into a lot of the nitty-gritty technical details. So talk to you all in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.